And I know people say that you go do travel in order to, sort of accumulate stuff, either literally stuff, souvenirs or experiences. But I think it's the opposite. I think you travel, or at least I do. I travel to shed myself and lighten my load and to unburden yourself. This is the tricky thing about happiness is it is a byproduct of a life lived well. I call people like Jared hedonic refugees. And they are refugees, people who are moving to another country not for economic opportunity or to escape political oppression or anything like that, but simply because they sense that they'll be happier there. And I know the Dalai Lama says, grow where you're planted. And I think that applies to most of us, but not all of us. I think there are some people who need to transplant themselves somewhere else.
Those were clips from the wonderful conversation you're going to hear today with Eric Weiner. We explore many of the themes in his book, The Geography of Bliss, where he takes readers across the globe to investigate not what happiness is, but where it is. You'll hear about Eric's experience living in India and working as a war correspondent covering the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, what it was like for him to walk away from a successful career at NPR to write this book, and his best advice for you if you're leaving behind a career you enjoy to pursue something else. Why your unhappiness is beautiful and essential to your happiness. Why being, quote, expectations free may be the best way to travel. Eric's rule of thumb for how much time to buffer into a destination visit. Why coming home may be the most important part of the travel experience. And can you really get away from yourself when you travel? All of that, plus much more. I'm also going to share my two biggest takeaways from this book, one of which has made a huge impact on my life and how I think about it. And a shout out to somebody in this listening community who is diving headfirst into a new adventure in life, all because he just got curious. I love this story, and I'm excited to share it with you. And plenty more coming your way right now. So buckle up, strap in, grab your favorite beverage, relax. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey there, it's Jason with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. I am beyond thrilled to share this conversation I had with you today. Eric is an incredible guy, funny as well. He's, of course, a New York Times bestselling author whose books have been translated into more than 20 languages, and an award-winning journalist. So much to talk about around happiness, which is a simple concept in principle, yet complicated in reality, right? It's something that we can assess about ourselves. What is our level of happiness? Is this something that's driving our decision making right now? Are we leaving a job because we are unhappy or unfulfilled, or we think we can be more content doing something else? And in this case, maybe being somewhere else. That's what Eric's talking about in The Geography of Bliss. How does happiness change around the world based on the places you have your physical body, whether you've grown up there or you're moving through a place or living there? And it's fascinating to me that happiness, although it's been debated for a long time in philosophy, it hasn't been researched for very long. In fact, I went onto the Erasmus University of Rotterdam website. It's eur.nl. And this is the Erasmus Happiness Economics Research Organization, or EHERO for short. And they said on their website, quote, empirical research on happiness started in the 1960s in several branches of the social sciences. So it hasn't been studied from a scientific perspective for long. They even have a graph here showing the amount of scientific publications on happiness by year, and it's just a big upward slope. It's like a skateboard half pipe kind of slope. And that's what's happening. So it's all pretty new in terms of the scientific community in the grand scheme of things. But as I mentioned, philosophically, this has been a topic that's been discussed for thousands of years. And I'd say quite often on this show, as well as it relates to travel, a lot of times, as I mentioned, this could be a motivator for creating a life of travel or building a lifestyle around travel, because travel is something that makes us happy, makes us content. Now, the question is why? And how do the places that we visit maybe play into that? And why are certain countries happier than other countries? And what can we learn from those countries and take home with us and implement into our own lives? And on and on. It's a deep topic just from one word: happiness, and the exploration of that within the global context, within the traveler's context. You'll hear a wonderful discussion all around that today. Stick around on the back end as well. I want to give a shout out to somebody in this listening community. And also at the end of the interview, I share my 2 biggest takeaways from Eric's book, which I highly recommend you read. Now, without further ado, let's slip and slide into the interview. This is me and Eric having a chat, and I will see you on the other side, my friend. Well, I'm honored to have you here and that you took the time to be on the show. It's fair to say that you're one of my new favorite authors after reading the book. You know, it's the highest compliment when I read the Geography of Bliss, and then right afterwards I went and bought 2 of your other books immediately. So then that's like, okay, there's something good going on there.
I appreciate that. It's good to hear.
Absolutely. I know you say that your obsession really, and to use your quote, is the intersection of places and ideas. And it is at this intersection, I believe, where the most fascinating aspects of life unfold, be it our search for happiness, wisdom, or creative expression, all of which kind of tie into your book. So we're going to hit on a lot of themes today. I'm going to start by using an interviewing hack that you actually suggested from your war correspondent days, which I do want to talk about. You said in the book, I've conducted hundreds of interviews. I've interviewed kings and presidents and prime ministers, not to mention heads of terrorist organizations like Hezbollah. Yet sitting here across from this kindly Dutch professor who looks like Robin Williams, I'm stumped. I resorted to an old trick employed by journalists and women who want to put a date at ease. You just asked him to tell him about yourself. So I'm going to ask you the same thing. Tell me about yourself. I'm turning it around on you, man.
That's my trick. You can't use my tricks. Those are copyrighted,
okay.
Patented. I'm going to punt it right back to you and say, could you be a little more specific? What do you want to know about me?
Well, everything. No, it was so hard to kind of figure out where to start with you because you've done so much in terms of your career and travel. A lot of the ideas you've discussed in the book, of course, which I want to dive into. You know, maybe starting a bit chronologically might make sense. I know you were living in India in the 90s, so
I'll back up to when I was 5 years old. Does that go far enough back for you? And
let's go all the way back there. Let's do it.
I decided I was going to run away from home. Unlike, I imagine a lot of 5-year-olds think they're going to run away from home, but I actually pulled it off and got like a mile or 2 or 3 miles from my house in Baltimore. And that's pretty far for a 5-year-old, far enough that my parents were freaking out and the cops were called. But I was just obsessed with this desire to see what was around the next corner and to keep going. And, you could argue I was running away from something. A year after my escapade, my parents did divorce, so maybe there was some unhappiness in the house. But I might have been running or walking to something, or both. And that's sort of been the dynamic throughout my life. I'm not going to take you through year by year because this will be a 10-hour podcast interview. But that has been a dynamic throughout my life, running away from something and running to something, and using travel as a means to be a better version of myself. I would say. Travel and writing are the two ways that my wife likes to say I'm better on the page and wiser on the page than I am in person. And I think I'm better on the road than I am when I'm stationary. So that's been a dynamic throughout my life.
In what ways do you think you're better on the road? What do you mean by that?
I think I'm lighter, not physically lighter. I still have to lose 10 pounds, but emotionally and mentally lighter. And I know people say that you go do travel in order to, sort of accumulate stuff, either literally stuff, souvenirs or experiences. But I think it's the opposite. I think you travel, or at least I do. I travel to shed myself and lighten my load and to unburden yourself. Because when you're on the road, you only have so much stuff with you. You've got a few books, you got a change of clothes. Even if you're a heavy packer, you're not a turtle. You're not taking your whole house with you. So you just have less stuff. And I love the hotel experience. I happened to be speaking to you this morning from a hotel room, which is about a quarter of a mile from my house, which sounds weird, but I've had a sewage problem, which I won't bore you with or shock you with. So the water company put me up in a hotel, and I immediately just felt lighter when I walked in the hotel room because it's not my stuff. It's not my furniture. I've got, 6 or 7 books with me that I've been reading, but I can ignore all the others and I can focus on your questions. And there are lots of towels, way more towels than anyone ever needs. What's with that? Just lots of 5 hand towels, 4 bath towels. It's like so you never have to worry about a towel in a hotel room too. So for all these reasons and more, I think I'm a better person on the road. Isn't
it funny that you can get that same feeling just a quarter mile from your house or whatever?
Yes, I think I'm going to have to write about this actually, because I've been thinking about it that, and it's weird to be staying in a hotel room so close to your house because you go into hotel travel mode when you check in, I'm in a new place. And, I almost was going to go to the front desk and say, can you recommend some local restaurants? And I'm like, wait a second. I know all the local restaurants. I live here. So it gives you the chance to be a tourist in your own town. Which is pretty cool and something I recommend. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's something on some level all of us have had to embrace over, the pandemic times and everything kind of. I mean, at least for people who love travel, it's a nice way to kind of try to have that travel mindset without going anywhere.
Yes. And there are, great thinkers through the ages. An Indian poet named Tagore who lived in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and he advocated this. He advocated just consciously trying to see your hometown through the eyes of a foreigner, through the eyes of a foreign tourist. And so, I mean, that's the thing about travel is it's not about the mileage. It's about the vision, it's about what you're seeing or what you're not seeing. So my theory about one of the reasons why travel can be so therapeutic for a lot of people, it's not the energy vortices. It's not, the food or the air quality or the distance from home. It's that you've sort of given yourself permission to reinvigorate your senses and to see things freshly.
Yeah. Why is that so hard to do in sort of routine-based regular life?
That's a good question. I think we get numb to the familiar. And I don't think they say familiarity breeds contempt, but really familiarity breeds numbness. It's not that we hate where we are. We just stop to see it and to hear it and to smell it. It is possible, as I said, to stay in a hotel a quarter mile from your house and to experience your hometown with fresh eyes. But it's just a lot easier to get on an airplane and go far away to something that truly is different. And it's a way of sort of short-circuiting that numbing factor, that numbing phenomenon of familiarity. And that's, I think, the real value of travel.
A part of it is, at least to me, is also sometimes there's freedom within just not having an identity in some ways. You know, when you're traveling, you land somewhere like nobody knows who you are or what you've done, and you're just
what crimes you've committed, what states you're wanted in, you know?
Yeah, right. Well, in some cases, yeah. So hopefully not in yours, but
no, and that is true, and that's why you can make a fresh start in a new place. You know, people say, oh, you know, you're still wherever you go, there you are. You can't get away from yourself. I don't think that's true. I think you can get away from yourself, or at least from one version of yourself. And you go to a new place, and as you say, you're right. People don't know you. You can try on a different persona. You can get that fresh start. It's the blank sheet of paper in front of you, and you can write whatever you want on it or paint whatever you want on it.
Yeah. Do you find there are different versions of you on the road when you travel around? Like, do you get to some of these destinations and a part of you sort of swoops into your body and takes over? Or
yeah, I become Shirley, a 22-year-old lap dancer. No, that's not true. I don't know where that came from.
You know what I mean, though, from an identity perspective.
I just become less neurotic, I would say. And I don't worry about things the way I worry about them back home. Time, you know, I think that for me at least, the sense of time changes on the road. It just becomes more expansive. There doesn't seem to be this great shortage of time that there is when I'm back home. When I'm on the road, the days seem longer in a good way. You know, ironically, I'm able to do more nothingness on the road than I am at home. I'm not one of those see everything, do everything travelers. I like to always build in a buffer when I travel. I estimate how much time I need in, say, Reykjavik, Iceland, and then I'll add on automatically 20-25% to that. And I never, ever regret adding on that extra buffer of time. My sense of time changes, my sense of who I am. But I'm, you know, still myself. You know, it's you know, we're all different versions of ourselves all the time. We're all recreating ourselves. And, you know, as you may know, science tells us that every 7 years, we're literally a new person because all the cells in our bodies have died and regenerated. So we're doing this all the time anyway. That the process, I think, is just accelerated on the road, and you know, and usually for a good way. You know, there are cases of people who become mass murderers when they travel or whatever, but for the most part, I think most people. I don't know how you feel, Jason, that if you're a better version of yourself on the road, and a worse version when you're cooped up in your looks like a very nice little attic in Oslo.
Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to when you said lightness, that word has a feeling to me, right? It's like almost the lifting of the sort of burdens of daily responsibility. And, you know, I found that I recently took a trip to London, and just, you know, I have a family and 2 kids and everything, and just not having that massive responsibility of making sure 2 people don't somehow like kill themselves every day on accident, you know?
Right.
It's
called parenthood. Yeah.
Yeah. Just that is, whoo. Yeah. That's just, you know, sometimes you need to kind of take a load off, but then the load comes off in different ways. Like you said, I loved that, you know, a lot of travelers do get accused of running away from something or their problems or whatever. I like your reframing of kind of like running to something.
And yeah, as I said, it might be both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. And you know, when I hear that, I get a little bit angry because, you know, that, oh, you're traveling, you're running away from something. Well, yeah, maybe I am, you know, like if the building that I'm in is on fire and I'm like running away, but what are you running away from? Like the building's on fire, you know, I'm going to where the building's not on fire. So running away from, you know, bad things is good. Actually, it's a good instinct, and running to something is good. It's only becomes a problem in my mind when you're running away from something that you should be working through and working out. And of course, the thing about travel is, for most people, it's not a permanent condition. Yeah, there are some, you know, lifelong full-time travelers, and we can talk about that, but I think that presents its own problems. But most people, you know, you return, you buy a round trip ticket, you know, and you come back, and you hopefully come back with that better version of yourself intact, for a while at least. That the idea is to keep traveling even when you're back home, in the sense that self-transformation is still taking place. It's tricky, though, I admit.
It kind of makes me think about the sort of cliche of, I'm going to travel the world to find myself. And I think there's something to that. At the same time, if you have that intention or that awareness around the trip, on the one hand, I feel like it can be a positive thing because you're kind of going with this intention of openness and learning, and maybe like a beginner's mind type of approach. On the other hand, maybe you could look at it as detrimental because it's maybe putting a lot of pressure on this trip to be this sort of magical pill. You know what I mean?
Right. And I've written about the dangers of expectations, and especially when it applies to travel. So in my research into happiness, I've concluded that expectations are one of the enemies of happiness. That the greater our expectations for anything, a new job, a journey, the less likely we are to derive pleasure and happiness from it. So if you say, I'm going around the world to find myself, that puts an awful lot of pressure on both the world and yourself. I think the best travel, in fact, the best way of living, is expectations free. It doesn't mean you don't do anything. It doesn't mean you just sit in your apartment, eating Doritos and watching television. It just means that you don't have any one expected outcome. So if you say, I'm going around the world to find myself, that implies that if you don't find yourself, whatever the heck that means, that your trip is a failure. And so I wouldn't recommend framing a journey in those terms.
But at the same time, you can also use travel as a tool for personal development and transformation, of course. So
I think that's the outcome. That's the side effect. You travel with an open mind, open heart, and you know that you want something to be different, but you don't know what that different is. And I think that coming back a transformed, happier person is the side effect of the experiences you have. It's not the objective. It's a sometimes can be a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one.
I love what you said there. Yeah, not knowing what the different is. I think that's one of those things that reveals itself sometimes during the trip, sometimes years afterwards or something.
Right.
The running away, running to something. Some of the things we've already touched on bring to mind, to me, just duality as a concept, and this is something that I know in Eastern philosophy they seem to be able to kind of pull off holding that duality and I don't know, maybe understanding it, whereas I think us from the Western mindset kind of like maybe struggle with duality as a concept.
That something can be this and that at the same time. We do, and the Indians in particular, as I've written, are very good at holding two opposing ideas in their head at the same time without their head exploding. Right. Our head tends to explode.
Yeah, I mean, how do you reconcile some of those? I know in the book, one of the things you said is, we want to achieve our happiness and not just experience it. Perhaps we even want to experience unhappiness, or at least leave open the possibility of unhappiness in order to truly appreciate happiness, which I totally agree with. I think you kind of have to have both. You can't have the dark without the light kind of thing. I don't know. I have a hard time sometimes reminding myself that it should be, or it's both, Yeah,
it's not, it is partly that you can't have the dark without the light, but it's also that the darkness has value and even beauty in itself. The darkness is not there merely to make us appreciate the light. It's also there because it has its own beauty. If you've ever been on a completely dark night and looked up at the stars, or just consider our emotional reaction to beautiful, sad music. We find beauty in that. So what I was saying there is that I was pushing back against this sort of smiley face version of happiness, that we need to feel pleasure and happiness all the time. There's a place for some grit and difficulty in our lives. And And at the end of the book, I do, spoiler alert, sort of conclude that, maybe happiness is not the end all and be all that we should be seeking, but something bigger, like a flourishing life or a meaningful life. And you can lead a meaningful life that is not necessarily a happy one all the time, or even most of the time. If you ask a single working mother of 3, are you happy? She'll likely say you're asking the wrong question. I'm needed. There's meaning in my life, but am I happy? I'm not so sure.
Just staying on the whole duality concept, I always find it's a bit of a struggle to kind of toe the line between, striving, being ambitious versus kind of being content with where you are and what you have. And that can relate to whatever. I mean, family, career, those types of things. What do you?
Well, there's a great little lesson in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu poem, where Lord Krishna is saying to Arjuna, Arjuna is a warrior. He's about to go into battle and he's nervous. He doesn't want to go. And Lord Krishna says basically, and I'm summing up here, you should put 100% effort into what you're doing, but have a precisely 0% invested in the outcome. So it's not the striving that causes our misery. It makes us suffer. It is the pegging our efforts to one particular outcome. You're doing a podcast. So Jason does a podcast and you put your effort into it. You prepare for your interviews. You clearly are prepared. You put your heart and soul into it. And then, like most podcasters, you want a big audience, and the bigger, the better. And maybe you have some number in mind of what is the number of downloads or reviews or whatever the metric is that will make you happy, that you will say that's a success. Well, you can't really control that outcome as much as we like to think we can control it. All you can do is put your effort into it. And, as Lord Krishna says, you have the rights to to your labor, but not to the fruits of your labor. That's outside your control.
How do you manage that as a writer, as a creator?
It's hard. It's really hard because, there's always that tendency to compare yourself to other writers. There's always someone more successful, more famous, more whatever. And we tend to compare ourselves to those people who are 1 or 2 rungs above us and ignoring the fact that there are people 50 rungs below us. And it really is, a crapshoot, writing a book, publishing it, seeing how it does. You hear stories about, famous books that, that initially were rejected by 17 or 170 publishers before they were published. Breaking through is you do your best, but there are no guarantees. And you can drive yourself crazy pegging your happiness to one particular outcome. And I write for myself. I know that sounds, maybe contrary to the advice you may have received, know your audience and write for your audience. I write for myself, and then I hope that, me being a somewhat intelligent sentient being, that other somewhat intelligent sentient beings will find meaning and find some joy in my words.
Yeah, I love that. It's a audience of one, I guess.
It is yourself, because I think the difference between writing a book or anything versus, designing a product for sale, when you're designing a product for sale, often marketing people will say, well, we need to do audience surveys, find out what the audience wants, and then, the consumers want, and then give it to them. That may work, with a notebook or sunglasses or something, but I don't think it works with writing, because people don't know what they want. There was nobody saying, God, I really would like to read a book about some grumpy, journalist who goes around the world looking for the happiest places. That's what I want. Nobody says that. Nobody, says that. And yet I deliver it. And apparently a lot of people wanted it.
Right. Yeah. How can you know? Right. So in that way, it's just being kind of true to yourself, going back to what you said, along those lines. You worked as a war correspondent, which is, this is fascinating to me, because that's a job, but maybe I'm speaking for myself or just a lot of people in the audience, but it's like you never actually get to meet and talk to a war correspondent, right? Or at least I don't.
Well, to be clear, I was a foreign correspondent by choice and a reluctant war correspondent because that was part of the job. I was never one of those people who was drawn to war and conflict like a moth to the light. But if you're a foreign correspondent, you're just, that's what you do. Not all the time, but a lot of the time is, if they're people killing other people on a large scale in your vicinity, that becomes the story you cover. And I never felt like a perfect fit for that job, that part of the job, at least. I mean, I was the kind of journalist who wanted to go off and do the feature story about Mother Teresa or something like that.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I want to hear more about this because you were working for National Public Radio and living in India. What was it like kind of being thrusted into the uncomfortable parts of that job? I mean, how did you...
It was, well, living in India, and we're going back a few years here, was amazing. It was the best 3 years of my life. Everything was new and raw, and I'd never... fresh. I'd never stepped foot in India, and I picked up and moved there, which was pretty crazy. We talked about travel and its power to transform us. I think those 3 years really transformed me. It also meant covering Afghanistan. Just before the Taliban took over in the 1990s, while they were in power, I went to Afghanistan, and after they lost power after 2001, I was there again. And that was difficult, a bit of a chicken when it comes to being shot at and things like that.
Well, I mean, it's really not for everybody, man.
And yet I did it. And the thing is, though, and I, with all due respect, and I really do respect my colleagues who are still doing this and are out there covering still Afghanistan 20 some years later, it's still in many ways the same story, which is terribly sad and tragic. But wars are kind of provide their own drama. You don't have to work to get the listener's attention or the reader's attention. It's war. There's immediate drama, and it kind of writes itself in that way. And I was more interested in the stories that treated the world not as this inventory of calamities, but as what I call a laboratory of ideas. Of good ideas, Petri dishes, trying microloans in Bangladesh, a story I covered, or, some, spiritual guru in India and what's he up to, and just all these experiments going on around the world on a much broader scale than we just see in my home country, the U.S. I mean, that's like, being a scientist and limiting yourself to one particular laboratory doing one kind of study when there are all these other labs and other petri dishes with all kinds of experiments going on. Why would you not want to just embrace that?
What did attract you to that career? Was it a combination of the travel and the journalism, or was it like sort of the travel first and let me see what types of jobs I can that travel with?
Well, I mean, I graduated from college with a pretty worthless degree in English literature.
Well, you are using that, right?
Yeah, no. Well, that's true. No marketable skills other than I could craft a sentence. And this, fierce desire to see the world, preferably with someone else paying for it. So being a foreign correspondent seemed like the perfect fit. And it took me a few years to get there, but I got there. And then I left, which we can talk about. And that's the hardest thing in life. One of the hardest things is, and I think this is a line from the New Testament somewhere actually, is letting go of things not meant for you. That's a lesson I've learned over the years the hard way, that, it's easy to walk away from a terrible job or a terrible marriage or a terrible, business, whatever. It's something that's almost right, but not quite right. And walking away from that, because if you're clutching on to the almost right thing, you have no room in your hands for the just right thing. And that was a big move I made.
Tell me a little more about that time in your life. What were you debating? What was sort of...
So I'd been a foreign correspondent for a good decade, and I could have kept going. And it was, like I said, in many ways satisfying. I was traveling the world on someone else's dime. I was telling stories. I was meeting the most interesting people in every country I went to. I had, an audience, and as a friend called me, a mini celebrity at NPR, with an emphasis on the mini. And it was very good, but it started to feel a little repetitive. Like, I would go to the Philippines or somewhere to cover a coup d'etat, and it seemed an awful lot like the 10 previous coup d'etats in other places. There was a sameness to the story, wherever it was, because, journalism does work off of a template, and that template doesn't really change. It's wars and famine and disease and, occasionally a feel-good feature story. And I felt the need to break free of that. And in two ways, if I can. One was to get more personal, to insert myself into the story, which you're discouraged from doing, really, as a journalist. To be funnier, which, again, you're largely discouraged from as being a journalist, especially a foreign correspondent. There aren't many funny foreign correspondents. And the third thing, which is really the biggest, I think, is I wanted to view the world in a more positive, optimistic way. And that is not something journalism does very well. There is a movement out there called solutions journalism, which I fully support. I think it's terrific, but it's still pretty much a fringe movement. For the most part, journalism still focuses on problems of the world, not potential solutions. And I was interested in the goodness of the world. And that's, I think, probably the main reason why I left daily journalism about a dozen years ago now, and I haven't looked back.
So it's a big part of that. Yeah, just what you're kind of surrounded with on a day-to-day basis over a period of years just sort of adds up to...
Yeah, it kind of seeps into you. And I'll be honest here. I was already and still am someone who wrestles with depression, have all my life. And, it can drag you down after a while. You're surrounding yourself with some pretty depressing stuff. I wanted to turn that on its head and go in a different direction.
So what was the first thing coming out of that you did?
Well, I came up with this idea to travel the world for a year, instead of looking at the most miserable places, to find the happiest places. And
that was the first project.
Yeah. I mean,
amazing.
I always wanted to write a book, and I had all these ideas, and, some writers don't have enough ideas. Others have too many. I fall into the latter camp. I just would have too many ideas, and they were all pretty good, but they were like the almost right idea. Right. And they weren't just right. And, I was sitting in a apartment in Almaty, Kazakhstan, and actually not on assignment, but adopting our daughter, Sonia, who was then 9 months old. And my wife and I were spending a couple months in Kazakhstan, going through a pretty long process. And we had lots of time on our hands when we weren't, visiting our soon-to-be daughter. And so my wife left for like an hour one day and came back, and I had the proposal for the Geography of Bliss written out.
Oh,
and
really?
she said, that's it. That's the book. And
yeah,
that was it. And then it became a longer proposal, and then it became a book. But it started with that germ of that idea. What if I looked at the world through this happiness lens, and looked at happiness through this global lens? What would that look like? And it's really quite nothing short of a miracle to have this idea in an apartment in Almaty, Kazakhstan, turn into a book that is wildly more successful than you could have imagined. It's been translated into 24 languages, and I don't want to just sound like I'm bragging here, but I'm just explaining that it's a miraculous thing. I'll never forget when my editor and publisher came to DC, where I live, to visit me before the launch of the book, and he had one of the first, what they call galley copies. This is a pre-publication copy of the book, but it looks like a real book, paperback form. And he handed it to me, and I got teary-eyed, and I noticed he noticed my reaction too. And he's, now the head of Simon & Schuster. He's been in the business a long time, but I think he appreciated that pleasure that a first-time author takes in seeing something that was just a little crazy idea in Almaty, Kazakhstan, turn into a physical book. Not a Kindle, I'm sorry, but a physical book. And that, I'll never forget that moment.
That's amazing. It's pretty spectacular when you can kind of pinpoint the birth of something like that and then look back and really see what it turned into. And I'm sure, I can imagine, I guess, that moment for you, just hearing some of your backgrounds, also, where you kind of came from and having to sort of have the confidence in yourself to make the leap to the next thing, even though you built up a name and a career.
Right.
And
it's so easy to stay comfortable and to do something, I'm not talking about the mind-numbing bureaucratic job that you have to escape. I'm talking about a job that's good, that's actually satisfying, that on many ways, as I said, almost right, but not quite right. And walking away from that's tough. But I think it's necessary. And then, in my case, I feel like I'm just where I should be, talking to you about this, right now, right here. And, so no regrets.
what is your best advice to somebody in that situation who's listening and they're like, holy crap, that's me, Eric. That's me. I'm in that place right now. I've got the golden handcuffs, man. What's the key? How do I navigate this? Everybody has got their own.
I don't know if they need my advice, given the great resignation that's taking place here right now. A lot of people are configuring their lives and readjusting their sights. And I think people are doing just fine. It's scary and liberating, but more liberating than scary. And it's not just one moment where that dramatic moment where you quit and walk away from the golden handcuffs. It's what you do afterwards. And and there will be ups and downs, and I've had ups and downs. My first book did phenomenally well. My second book was pretty much a flop, but I kept going, and, I'm working on my fifth right now. So it's not a straight line trajectory.
Just so we can dive in to the book a little bit, The Geography of Bliss, I was wondering if you could just give listeners an overview of the framework within which you traveled the world looking for happiness, and kind of how the book is structured.
So, as I said, I treat the world as a laboratory of ideas. So this big idea was, what is happiness, and where is happiness? How, what do other countries know about happiness that perhaps we Americans do not? What lessons can we learn? And also, what interesting happiness experiments are going on? If, for instance, you believe that money can buy happiness, then surely the wealthiest country in the world on a per capita basis, Qatar in the Persian Gulf, they should be happy, right? Well, let's see how that experiment's going. Or, let's see how, what if you made happiness a national policy, as they do in Bhutan with gross national happiness? What does that look like? So it was partly a journalistic enterprise in that, I was still had the mindset of a journalist, in that I was, talking to people and trying to uncover actual data about where the happiest places are. But for a different end, I'm looking to show you what you can learn from these places. And so I went to 7, 8 countries around the world with an open mind, but always through this happiness, wearing my happiness goggles, and looking for what people said and what they did about, how they were happy or unhappy, as the case may be, and inserting myself as a interested investor in this project. Let's put it that way, because, as I said, I've wrestled with depression. I wanted to be happier, and I'm a traveler, and it seemed like a natural combination to fit these two together.
What were some of the key insights coming out of that? I mean, if you can break it down by country, or just, sort of overall kind of takeaways. I know I have two big takeaways from the book that I'm going to share at the end, but I'd love to hear some of the things that kind of stuck with you over time, whether it's individuals or the sort of.
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, first of all, I was quickly disabused of the notion that I'd be traveling only to tropical paradises with palm trees and drinks with umbrellas in them. Those countries, these, the Bahamas and Tahitis of the world are not really the happiest. We tend to associate that scene, that sort of setting, with happiness. But in fact, that's not the case. The happiest countries in the world, statistically, because they survey people around the world and ask them essentially on a scale of 1 to 10 overall, how happy are you? The happiest places tend to be cold, dark places like Finland and Denmark and Iceland, which I write about. So that was a bit of a surprise, and it sort of made me think that, a week's vacation in paradise is not necessarily paradise. It's not sunny skies and beaches that make for a happy place. And I quickly discovered, well, maybe not so quickly, but I did discover that really happiness is not what I thought it was. It's not personal. In fact, I was in Bhutan, Himalayan country, sandwiched between China and India, and talking to a man named Karma. And it's always a good day, I think, when you meet a man named Karma. He clearly did something right in a previous lifetime. And I'm talking to Karma, and he says, Eric, I don't understand you Americans. You're always talking about your personal happiness. He said, happiness isn't personal. It's 100% relational. Now, at the time, I thought Karma was kind of exaggerating to making a point to the dumb American that, using a big number, 100%, maybe it's 50, 60% relational. But as I traveled and as I did more research, I discovered that Karma was spot on. It is pretty much 100% relational. And it's a different way of looking at happiness. It's about our relations with other people, and it could be loved ones like family, it could be friends, could be the barista you encounter at the coffee shop, your relations like that. And that is hugely important. And an element of that is trust. And trust is a sort of one non-negotiable when it comes to a happy place. You need to have trust of one another. Switzerland, lots of trust in that country and lots of happiness. Moldova, which I visited, perhaps the least happy country in the world statistically, not a lot of trust. Lots of envy, not a lot of trust. So that's one sort of main takeaway that I came away from my research and my travels. And another thing that stuck with me actually came from Thailand, where they have expressions like "mai pen lai," which means literally never mind. The notion that not every problem needs to be solved right then and there, that it can wait. And I suppose this is a Buddhist idea, not coincidentally. And they also have an expression in Thailand that translates as "you think too much." And Thais do see excessive thinking as a sign of mental illness, which would make both of us, Jason, probably clinically insane, I keep coming back to that as well. So yeah, I mean, quite a few things, because I met some remarkable people on the road. And one reason I think I met them is, I followed the golden thread, as my friend called it, that you would, say, if I were to go to, say, Norway, I would say, Jason, who should I talk to in Norway? You just give me a long list and talk to these people. And you say, but really, that's the person you want to talk to. And I'd go to talk to Hans or someone in Norway. And Hans, who else should I talk to? And they give me names and you follow the thread. And the thread works, for me at least, I think partly because my intentions are good. And I think people I talk to sense I am not just being a drive-by journalist, not just being transactional, like I just want a tape cut or a quote from you. In fact, I've stopped using the word interview for the conversations I have with people when I'm researching my books. I'm having conversations. I'm talking to them. Because in my mind, at least, the term interview is transactional, trying to get something from you, get you to reveal information or to say something smart and pithy. And then once I have it, we're done. I've maintained friendships with quite a few people I've written about in Geography of Bliss and my other books. And And that's nice. And that's a totally different orientation from being a journalist.
I might steal that. Start just, hey, you want to have a conversation? That's what this is, right? I mean, that's what
there
it's
you
about.
go.
I think
you can borrow it. You don't have to steal it, or you can steal it. I don't care.
I'll borrow it. I'll take it on loan. Having the conversations and sharing them, there's so much value in that for all of us to just glean these different perspectives.
And how you frame the question, frame the situation. Is this an interview or is this a conversation? And a conversation implies it's two-way, right? And with an interview, there's an interviewer and the interviewee. The conversation, there's just two conversers, right? On an essentially equal plane. And that's how I try to think of it.
Do you think that inserting yourself in the story, to use your words, I don't know if you call that gonzo journalism or whatever you want to call it, is that the sort of the thing that allows you to break that barrier and make it more of a conversation as opposed to capturing the story?
I believe the term comes from Hunter L. Thompson in his gonzo journalism. I don't love that phrase now. I tend to think I see myself as a writer and not a journalist anymore. And as a writer, I can do whatever the heck I want, right? And except make stuff up if I'm writing nonfiction, which I don't do. So I am not just inserting myself into the story or the conversation. I'm part of it. I'm trying to be part of it to varying degrees. Sometimes I step back and let karma speak and quote him at length or tell his story. But I can have. What I find so liberating is I can have reactions to the people and places I meet. I remember once I spent 2 weeks in Afghanistan reporting on what's going on there. Came back to my base in Delhi, filed all these reports, and then some friends back home said, "Oh, I heard your stories from Afghanistan. What's it really like there?" And I'm thinking, shoot, if you don't get a sense of what it's really like there from my reports, what's the point? And so what I try to do now is all that stuff that journalists used to talk about over drinks at the bar, I try to put into my writing, so that it's unfiltered and it's no one's going to ask what's it really like in Bhutan or Iceland, that I'm able to convey that, I hope.
I mean, I think it's important to have a healthy skepticism for a lot of media, I guess I would say.
I mean, I don't mean to be bashing media, and I hope that's not how I come across. I'm just saying that it's a different approach, and I've stepped off that train and onto another train.
Yeah, I mean, we know that the facts are that clicks and ads and things like that is what pays the salaries at these companies. So there's an element of we don't have to get into all that.
Right. Then we'll go down that rabbit hole. We'll never get out. We'll never emerge.
Right. One of the things that stood out for you, that also stood out for me, was what you shared from Thailand, which is that idea of, we think too much, right? So we're both insane, like you said, jokingly, but sometimes I wonder that. And I'm really attracted to the Eastern philosophy for that reason. I feel like there's some kind of, there's something valuable about zenning out, if you will. But it's funny because I always have a hard time imagining, I wish I could just insert myself into somebody else's brain who thinks that, because I think a certain way, and then I'm trying to incorporate some of those concepts into my thinking instead of just thinking that way because I'm born in it. You know?
I mean, people who meet the Dalai Lama, and I've only met him from a distance, and they come to him and say, I want to become a Buddhist, and they're Jewish or Christian or whatever. And he actually advises them to grow where they're planted. And that's I think the beauty of Buddhism and in other Eastern religions is it's not all or nothing. You can remain Jason and, and incorporate these practices like meditation into your life. So that I find very beneficial. I don't think the point is to become, for some people it is to shave your head and become a monk and take the vows, and that's fine. But for a lot of other people, it's to still be Eric or Jason, but again, to be a better version of ourselves, not to be a new self, right? But to be a better version of yourself. And that's the key, I think.
What is your relationship with Bhutan?
We're just friends.
It seems like you have something special going on there.
No, actually, I would say, what's that thing on Facebook you put? It's complicated.
It's complicated. Yeah. I mean, because you run your writing workshops there, right?
Well, I hope to. I've been running these writing workshops in the Himalayas the last 4 or 5 years. All of them in Kathmandu in Nepal. They've been terrific. But this year, in 2020, my business partner in this venture, James, and I were going to take it to Bhutan, and we had everything arranged. And then this little pandemic happened. We're hoping to do it again in May, or to reschedule it for May. And I also hope that'll be teaching mainly foreigners, Americans mostly, but I'm also going to stay on and teach some young Bhutanese, or lead a workshop with some young Bhutanese writers, which I'm looking forward to. I mean, it's a special place. I have not been back since I researched the book. It's tricky to get to. Well, I know one American who married a Bhutanese person and has been living there most of her life, and wrote a wonderful book called Married to Bhutan. And she's, immersed in the culture and being there. I just hold it up as an example of what if we just, instead of making gross national product or gross domestic product the be all and end all, we had this thing called gross national happiness. What would that look like? I mean, it's a wonderfully delicious, intriguing idea. And if you've ever read the book by James Hilton, The Lost Horizon, about Shangri-La, you'll see the similarities to an extent. It's just the closest I felt to being in something like Shangri-La, to stepping out of our everyday existence into a place that's truly different. And it's not easy to find those these days. There's Starbucks everywhere, McDonald's most places, and the convenience of jet travel has made us a little, we've taken travel for granted, at least until the pandemic came along, and just assumed we could always go anywhere, anytime. And, obviously it's not true.
It's easy to kind of just assume that, well, of course the economy is the driving force of everything, right? Like that's, of course, duh. That everything's built around that. Or the
notion that economic growth is inherently good.
Right. Right. As opposed to just like remembering it's actually a choice that we're all making.
Right. And not all growth is good. If you have a tumor, you don't want that to grow. It's a work in progress in Bhutan, this policy of gross national happiness, and they've been working on it for a while. I think the beauty of it is not necessarily in the execution, but frankly in the idea that there could be another way. And what that other way looks like, we're still figuring out. Countries like the UK and France have dabbled in this area. In Dubai, there is a Ministry of Happiness, which is pretty cool. So there are countries around the world that are trying to emulate Bhutan. And again, it's the laboratory of ideas. This petri dish in the Himalayas produced something quite remarkable.
Yeah, because this is a government policy, this gross national happiness. And I mean, this kind of brings me to the question of, if there's a happiness problem, right? If we call it that, right? Let's say there's a happiness problem in America, and depending on your perspective and where you are in America and who you are, what you have your eyes open to or not, you can interpret that in different ways. But if there is a happiness problem in X, Y, and Z country, is it solvable? Is it a solvable thing with a policy, a government policy like this, or some other way?
I don't know if I'd frame it exactly as a happiness problem, because this is the tricky thing about happiness is it is a byproduct of a life lived well, and maybe this is why Bhutan has struggled so much. Is it doesn't work that well to have it as a direct objective. I mean, it's very tricky. There was a British philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who said back in the 19th century that happiness should be approached sideways like a crab, that you can't tackle it head on. So you can put policies in place with the intention of, it's like a farmer, you're working the land, you're watering your crops, you're harvesting, you're hoping that you get a good crop. But ultimately, it's not really up to you. And happiness sort of works the same way. Look, in the U.S., we consume more self-help books and produce and consume more self-help books than any country in the world, but we're not the happiest. In Thailand, a pretty darn happy place. They don't They don't, spend too much time thinking about happiness or thinking too much, apparently, about anything. They're too busy just being happy. So I realize that may sound strange from someone who wrote a book about happiness, but you can overthink this too. And you do these things that we know lead to happiness, but you don't just keep your eye on the target. Like, I want to be happy. Like, if you woke up every morning, Jason, said, I want to be happy today, that's probably not going to work, because that's just an idea of happiness. And what do you do then? Do you take a shower? Do you go for a walk? I mean, it's more that you do things that are meaningful and productive in the best sense of the word, and connect you with other people. And then happiness is the side effect of this medication, basically a pleasant side effect.
I mean, do you think it's something that's teachable? If somebody's saying, "Oh, well, I want a more happiness, or let's call it meaning, or whatever in my life."
This is the blissologists, as I call them, the positive. There's a field known as positive psychology. It's the science of happiness. This has been debated for a long time. Like, or surely someone's born with a predisposition to happiness, and I'm of the school that says that basically we're born with a range. I'm probably never going to reach Oprah levels of happiness, or wealth for that matter, or fame, but I have a range, and through my actions and my thoughts and my intention, I can either operate toward the very top of that range or at the bottom. So to answer your question, I think yes, that we can, to some extent, choose to be happier by choosing to do these things, but within that range. That I'm not denying that genetics doesn't play a role; it does, but I think it's less of a role than we think, and I think the range is pretty broad.
Let's go back to the idea of the geography of bliss, like literally the geography, because you had one line in the book that you were talking about this guy, Jared. You said, over the years, I met so many people like Jared who seemed to be more at home, happier living in a country not of their birth. And then when you said the Dalai Lama thing, where you kind of should be sort of happy within where you grow, again, they have the duality there maybe, but why are some people more at home or happier, more relaxed living?
I call people like Jared hedonic refugees. And they are refugees, people who are moving to another country not for economic opportunity or to escape political oppression or anything like that, but simply because they sense that they'll be happier there. And I know the Dalai Lama says, grow where you're planted. And I think that applies to most of us, but not all of us. I think there are some people who need to transplant themselves somewhere else. And Jared just fell in love with Iceland and one of those stopovers, the cheap flights to mainland Europe, and 48-hour stopover in Iceland, and so he forgot his 3-week trip to wherever he was in Europe, mainland Europe. Iceland's part of Europe, but Iceland stuck with him, and he moved back, and he moved there, and he lived there, and he's happy there. And I've met people who have similar feelings about India or other countries where they were not born. I think that's not the point of my book, though, is not that you should pick up and move to Iceland, because if a bunch of unhappy Americans just picked up and moved to Iceland, thinking they'd be happier there, they're going to dilute the happiness of Iceland by bringing all this American unhappiness. That's one problem.
Yeah.
And it's not practical for a lot of people, and it's not even desirable. I think the point of my book is you can travel to these places, read about these places, and imbibe their essence and their approach to happiness and bring it back home with you. Yeah. You can take it with you.
Isn't that one of the best parts of having the privilege of traveling the world, is to be able to then curate the best of the things that you love the most, whether it's, for me, certain things might be about parenting or just about a way a culture is, and then try to bring those things back home with you and incorporate them into your life.
There are many stages of travel. There's preparing, there's traveling, but then there's coming home. Coming home is part of the travel experience, and maybe it's the most important part.
One thing I loved about Iceland that really stood out to me from the book was this idea that they're happy because it's okay to fail. that came out of your chapter for me, because you mentioned it's a place where there are more artists and writers per capita than any other. And this guy Larus, I think, I don't know how to pronounce his name, said it's because of failure. Failure doesn't carry a stigma in Iceland. In fact, in a way, we admire failures. And that to me said a lot,
Yeah. Well, in the U.S., we pay lip service to the notion of admiring failure, but it's only retrospectively. The story about
after they've conquered the mountain.
Yeah, this young upstart college dropout who started a company but failed 10 times, but now Mr. Jobs or Mr. Zuckerberg are doing very well. Thank you very much. Then we like the failure story.
Not the people that are still in the garage tinkering.
In Iceland, they like the guy who's still in the garage tinkering.
Right.
They
That's beautiful.
They're Vikings at heart, and genetically too. And they admire the noble failure, who doesn't go on to be a success. But they fail. It's what you fail at that matters more than that you're failing. You're failing at the right thing. You're failing at something big and noble. And I think that's what the Icelanders admire.
Just a few more for you. I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up technology and smartphones. Right. I was just wondering what your relationship is with the smartphone.
It's complicated.
Again,
that's all my relationships. They're all complicated. Yeah,
it has to be part of the debate about happiness now, right?
I've got a 16-year-old daughter who gives me a hard time because she thinks I'm on my smartphone more than she's on hers. And she might be right. I think she's of the, digital native generation where she doesn't feel as tethered to it. It's a constant struggle to, and I think this is especially true actually for people like myself and yourself who work for ourselves. Maybe you have a lucrative day job. I'm not sure, but okay. When you work for yourself, your contact with the world is limited. So you're looking for feedback, for encouragement, for anything, and the phone sort of becomes that. It becomes actually more important for the self-employed like us, I think. And there's the danger that you always turn to it. Writing is hard. I had to get this program called Freedom, which I paid $10. Freedom costs $10, by the way, if you're wondering. That Freedom is not free. It's only $10, and it blocks me from the internet for a period from 15 minutes to 8 hours. And I'm thinking it's pathetic that I need this, but I do.
It's successful for a reason, Eric.
Yes,
right?
And so about Freedom. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And
the name says it all.
People have high flying jobs. They don't need freedom because they're always connected. They're always on. It's always that possibility of distraction from doing the serious work of writing or having a conversation like we're having. I physically turned my phone off before we started chatting, and I was just sitting there like this, this artifact, and dead thing, and good for. I feel oddly liberated just looking at the black screen that's off. And this conversation reminds me I should do that more often. So, I'm just as distractible as the next person. I'm less distracted on the road. I'm less tethered to my phone on the road. Another good reason to travel is, you're going to go through some digital detox on the road by necessity. You'll be on a different time zone from other people, which can be liberating in itself.
Absolutely. I get that every morning when everybody's sleeping and I have
I love that. If you're in that part of the world in Europe, you get that 5, 6, 7 hours before the rest of the world wakes up, and it feels like free time. It always felt that way to me. But then, of course, you get people contacting you at 10, 11 p.m. saying, let's talk.
That's the downside. Yeah.
Right.
It's a nice time to create, though. You have that.
Right. I always enjoyed that.
A couple selfish questions because I have to, you're an established professional journalist, have been doing it for a long time. Give me your best interviewing advice, man, or at least just your best conversations advice, whatever.
Right. We don't use the term interview, right?
Right.
So we're kind of.
I'm learning here.
It's a conversation. So reframe it that way. You're having a conversation with someone. You have some questions in mind ahead of time, but you're not going to stick to them necessarily. You have to be willing to follow the person you're conversing with to where they're going. If they're going on a tangent, you nudge them back. But if it looks like maybe a really interesting tangent or interesting direction, you have to be willing to go off script and to go with it. Your questions should not be longer than their answers, which some podcasters have a tendency to ask 3, 4, 5 minute long questions for a 30-second response. You don't have that problem, but some do.
Sometimes I do.
And, it's hard. You have to be just naturally curious about the other person. You have to care. And that's not like I could give you a bunch of like gimmicks, like the placebo question, which is a question that just warms someone up. You don't really care about the answer, placebo question. But these are like techniques when really it's like you have to actually care about the other person and what they have to say. And there's no substitute for that. I'm sorry if there's not like a bag of tricks for that. And
no,
but you seem to care. So I don't think you have a problem there.
No, that's wonderful advice. Thanks for sharing that. Your writing is incredible, astounding. I love it. And like I said, I'm a fan, and I wanted to get your best advice for creative writing specifically. You have a way of kind of bringing all these ideas together. I don't know how you do it.
I think the biggest hiccup people have with writing is they think it should be easy. They think it either will be easy or they think it should be easy. And that's not true.
Maybe because you make it look so easy.
No, but
your fault now.
That's the finished. That's the finished product. You don't know how many revisions and hair wringing or head wringing, whatever, some kind of hand wringing. Wringing was what was going on. And so my favorite quote about writing, and it's how I begin every one of my writing workshops, is from Thomas Mann, the German novelist and writer. And he said, the definition of a writer is this: a writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people. A writer is someone for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people. And when I tell people that quote, they sort of just exhale. It like takes the pressure off, like, oh, this is supposed to be hard. And it sounds crazy. Why would writing be harder for a writer than for a non-writer? Because the writer cares. The writer is invested in it. So my first advice would be just get over this idea that it should be easy. It's hard, and it's just as hard in my 5th book as the first. The only difference is I sort of know that I'll get through it. To that old famous saying, do you like writing? And the answer is, I like having written. That's true. And my last piece of advice is, when I was working on, to bring it back to the Geography of Bliss, when I was working on it, I'd never written a book. I'd written articles, I'd written scripts for NPR, but I'd never written a book at all. And I got nervous. I told a friend, I said, look, I want to write a good book, And she said, stop with this good book nonsense. She said, just write an honest book. And I found that very liberating, not to write well, but to write honestly. And if you write honestly, it will be good. And I think that was very good advice that I'll pass on.
And it turned out great as well.
Thank you very much.
2 things I just want to share quickly. Just a couple of my favorite takeaways from the book. I was going to do this later, but you're here and I want to share them with you. The one is when you were sitting on the hill in Switzerland and you said, maybe happiness is this, not feeling like you should be elsewhere, doing something else, being someone else. I think that's perfect for travelers, wanderers, nomads, especially, people that are used to kind of roaming around. You're always kind of thinking about what's the next thing, and the hedonic treadmill.
One
right?
line from the book that seems to live on and is quoted the most often, perhaps. And I need to remind myself of what I've written, which I know sounds crazy. Like I would read that and say, "Oh yeah, that's good advice. Who said that? Oh yeah, I said that." So I think it's true, and I think it's true of traveling as well. That it's not seeing the next great site and checking things off your list. It's just being.
Yeah. And the second one that really impacted my life, I've been thinking about it a lot since I read it, is, well, let me share it first. You were talking about Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, who said when asked what the main aim of his life had been, was to be a good ancestor. And that hit me really hard because it's a way to think about the legacy you want to leave while essentially taking your ego out of the equation.
Right, because you'll be gone. That's the thing about being an ancestor. You'll be gone.
It's big thinking, but at the same time, like almost ego-free big thinking in many ways.
Right. And I think that is quite good and quite true. And to sort of widen your circle of awareness of your place in the world. And, I think as people get older, they do start to, their ego can become more diffuse, and they see themselves as, not a distinct wave, but, a wave that's part of a much bigger ocean and will return to the ocean. So I think that's what Jonas Salk was hinting at as well.
Mm. Well, Eric, thanks so much for your time today. The Geography of Bliss, of course, we that was the main topic, and it's a wonderful book. Can't recommend it highly enough.
Thanks, Jason. I enjoyed the conversation.
I hope you did. Thank you.
Not the interview, the conversation.
Thank you very much. And let's do it again soon sometime. Come through Oslo. I'd like to do this in person over a coffee or a beer or something. It'd be
that sounds like an excellent idea. Thank you, Jason.
Right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
There you have it, my conversation with Eric. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What a privilege to read a book like The Geography of Bliss that just blows me away, and then knowing I get to have a chat with the author and share it with you. It's incredible. It's really what makes me happy to be able to have this podcast and share these conversations with you and with others all over the world. Thank you for being here. And if you haven't gotten in touch yet, another thing that lights me up is when people reach out to say hi. You can always drop me a line. Jason@zerototravel.com is my email. And you can leave me a voicemail easily. There's a link in the show notes, or you can email it to me like this member of the community did. I want to play you a quick voicemail from DK in Singapore, who is making a big change, diving into a new life adventure. Here's DK.
Hey Jason, I am DK from Singapore, and I just wanted to let you know that your show has been such an inspiration for myself, right? Actually, it was through your podcast that I am planning to go to Estonia at the end of the year to study, right? It was actually the episode with Jen Vermont. Then I think you guys were talking about going to Estonia to study, or maybe Estonia being one of, or Tallinn being one of the cities that she liked. And then I was like, interesting. I went to find out more, and it turns out that there is a course there that I really wanted to go to. So that should be happening this year. And also another thing is your show really is inspiring me to actually start my own podcasting journey. And the idea is it's still in the works, but the idea is, or at least the show is called Singaporeans Abroad, right? And the idea is just to talk to Singaporeans living in other countries, just to give people or us at home a bit more perspective about living abroad, how we can go overseas, and what are certain challenges that they face, or what are certain pros and cons, But yeah, that's the idea. I'm still trying to work on it, but I think it was through your podcast that I built the idea, actually. So I would like to say a big thank you, and also I'm really appreciative of your podcast being so insightful and being so inspiring. And so thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you, DK, for taking the time to listen to the show and to drop me a line and a voicemail. I just love that you went with your curiosity. This is how I wanted to finish this show. We can't always know what's going to make us happy. You hear these stories all the time. People might think that money will make them happy, and then they win the lottery and they end up losing all their money, or their lives end up miserable because maybe it makes things more complicated, or whatever the case. You hear about people who have a lot of money who are not happy. You hear about people that switch careers that think they're going to be happy in their new career, and it turns out that they missed their old career, or they get out of a relationship and they realize they made a mistake. All these things happen all the time, all over the world. Trying to be our own judges of what's going to make us happy can be really hard, but I think one thing we can do is we can follow our bliss in some regard, to use a word from Eric's book, The Geography of Bliss. We can follow our bliss through our curiosity, right? If our curiosity is pulling us somewhere, is probably some element of happiness within that thing we're getting pulled towards, right? In DK's case, he was intrigued by the idea of living in another country, going to school in another country. He heard about it on the podcast. He decided to explore that curiosity, dive in, and found that there was a course that matched something he wanted to do. And now he's going in that direction. And with his thoughts around starting a podcast, same sort of thing, right? He's just being pulled towards it. And sometimes it's hard to follow our bliss. That sounds very extreme, right? I do think there's a way to sort of gently follow our bliss, to follow our curiosity and see where it takes us. I think often if we are curious about something that's different than what we're doing, some kind of life change, and we're exploring that, there's something to that. In a way, we wouldn't probably be exploring it if we didn't think it was going to maybe add an element of happiness or contentedness to our life. So my thought is, let's keep getting curious, keep exploring that curiosity, see where it takes us. And when you decide to go somewhere with it, it's one thing to read about a podcast, another thing to start one, for example. You just go in and then you have the experience. You can't really know what's going to make you feel more happy. I'm using air quotes. More content, whatever it is that we're searching for within that, until we actually do it. And then it's all about enjoying the process, right? Not necessarily the end result where we think that's going to take us, but the process of creating. And in traveling, maybe it's just about enjoying the experience of where you are, wherever that may be, and not having those expectations. As Eric mentioned, being free of expectations, and just once you get off and running, just enjoying the experience and taking it for what it is and taking from it what you will. And in the end, does it make you happier? Does it make you more content? That's for you to decide, of course. But we won't know until we go and actually do those things. So stay curious, be open, and be you. That's all we can all be, right? All right, I'll leave you with a quote from Brahmajna Ma, who said, "Without self-realization, no one can ever be content." Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by ZeroToTravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.